So, what if I told you that one of the most profound guidebooks for surviving our modern era, the age of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and just massive digital burnout. What if I told you that it was actually buried in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert like 1,700 years ago?
I mean, it honestly sounds like the setup to some historical thriller movie, right?
Yeah.
But it is an absolute reality. The text we're looking at today fundamentally challenges how we view established institutions
Yeah.
and how we relate to authority, and honestly, most importantly, how we understand our own internal compass.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are exploring a really fascinating modern commentary on a text known as the Gospel of Thomas.
Right.
And just to be clear, right from the jump, we aren't just doing some dry history lesson today. Our goal is to unpack what this ancient, heavily censored document actually has to say to you right now as you navigate a world of just total information overload.
Exactly. And, to really grasp the weight of this commentary, we first have to understand the sheer scale of how this text actually re-entered the modern world.
Right, the timeline is wild.
It really is. So we are looking at the mid-1940s. The world is completely reshaping itself in the aftermath of a massive global war.
Yeah.
And within a single year of each other, two monumental archaeological discoveries happen. And not by, heavily funded university teams, but by totally everyday people.
The juxtaposition there is just amazing to me. So in 1946, you have a Bedouin shepherd who is just wandering near Qumran by the Dead Sea, and he stumbles into a cave.
Right.
And he uncovers the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
Over 900 religious documents, mostly in Hebrew, dating all the way back to the 2nd century BCE.
Which is huge on its own.
Massive. But just a year prior to that, in 1945, something arguably even more mysterious happens over in Egypt.
Yes, in the village of Nag Hammadi. So there's an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali, and he's literally just out digging for fertilizer. Yeah, and his tool strikes a sealed earthen jar. Inside that jar, he finds 12 leather-bound papyrus codices, which are essentially early books.
Right.
And this becomes known as the Nag Hammadi Library. It's a collection of early Christian Gnostic texts, all written in a language called Coptic.
Okay, let's pause on that word Gnostic for a second, because that term gets thrown around a lot in history documentaries and stuff, but I feel like it can be really confusing.
It definitely can be.
What does that actually mean in the specific context of these texts?
That is a really crucial distinction to make. So the word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which simply means knowledge.
Okay.
But the author of our source material really emphasizes that this isn't about intellectual textbook knowledge. It is about a secret, internal, intuitive knowledge of the divine.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so these aren't texts outlining church rules or, administrative hierarchies. They are texts focused entirely on internal mystical discovery.
Interesting. So if these texts are all about internal spiritual discovery, why are they buried in a sealed jar in the dirt? Because, books don't just naturally end up underground.
They definitely don't. And this is where the historical detective work really comes in. The English translator of the Nag Hammadi Library, James Robinson, proposed a theory that's pretty widely accepted now.
Okay, what was his theory?
He noted that these codices likely belonged to a nearby Pachomian monastery.
Pachomian meaning what exactly?
So Pachomian monasticism was one of the earliest forms of communal living for monks. Instead of going out and living in a cave entirely alone like a hermit.
Right, the classic image of a monk.
Exactly. Instead of that, these monks gathered together to share resources, labor, and crucially, they shared texts. They were a community of seekers, basically, and they collected a really wide variety of spiritual writings to study.
That actually sounds like a pretty open-minded intellectual environment.
It was.
So what changed? Who forced them to put their entire library in a jar?
The broader political and religious climate essentially clamped down on them. In the year 367 AD, the very powerful Archbishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued this official letter. And this letter basically laid down the law on what was considered official canonical scripture. And he formally condemned any non-canonical texts as flat-out heresy.
Wow. So the institution establishes this really strict boundary, and suddenly being a curious monk with a diverse library becomes a massive liability.
Precisely. If you're a monk who values these mystical writings, you have
Yeah,
a terrible choice to make. You can either burn the books to comply with the archbishop, or you can risk your life to keep them.
that is heavy.
Right. So as a compromise, they took these codices, placed them in a jar, sealed it tightly with bitumen to protect the papyrus from the elements, and they buried it.
They basically created a time capsule to survive the censorship of their era.
I did, and it worked.
It's incredible. They
Yeah.
just sat in the dark for almost 1,600 years
Yeah.
while, entire empires rose and fell. But uncovering the jar is really only half the battle, right? Because once scholars actually read the Gospel of Thomas from this jar, they realized something that completely shifted our understanding of ancient history.
Yes, they did. So the text in the jar was written in Coptic, but scholars quickly realized it was actually a translation of a much older Greek original.
Oh, wow.
And the way they proved this involves a totally separate archaeological site called Oxyrhynchus.
Oxyrhynchus.
Yeah. Decades earlier, in 1898, archaeologists in this completely different part of Egypt had found this massive trove of ancient Greek manuscripts in an ancient rubbish dump.
Just in a literal garbage dump.
Literally. And among them were these fragments of mysterious sayings dating back to roughly 80 AD. But for decades, nobody knew what larger book these Greek fragments actually belonged to.
So we basically have these mysterious Greek fragments just sitting in a museum for 50 years, totally disconnected from anything.
Exactly. Until the Nag Hammadi jar is finally opened. Once the intact Coptic Gospel of Thomas was translated, scholars cross-referenced it with those Oxyrhynchus fragments.
And they matched.
They realized those mysterious Greek scraps were actually pieces of the original Greek version of the Gospel of Thomas.
It's like finding a cover of a song in a completely different genre.
Yeah.
Like you find the acoustic version in one part of Egypt, the heavy metal version in another part.
Right.
But when scholars strip away the instruments in the different languages, they can see the melody and the lyrics are the exact same. They share the exact same linguistic DNA.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it, honestly. Textual criticism relies heavily on finding that shared DNA.
Makes sense.
When you have fragments in Greek from 80 AD and a full translation in Coptic from the 300s, it proves that these philosophical ideas were moving. They were adapting and being translated across cultures dynamically.
But, finding the text is one thing. Figuring out what a dead 1,700-year-old hybrid language is actually saying to us today requires a completely different kind of archaeology.
Definitely.
And the author of our source commentary points out a really fascinating local context here. The Nag Hammadi texts were unearthed right around the exact same time Korea was liberated from Japanese colonial rule.
Which is an amazing parallel.
Yeah, we are approaching the 80th anniversary of both events. But over those 8 decades, the author notes that mainstream religious institutions have largely just ignored this text.
And the author is highly critical of that marginalization, which is exactly why they took such a unique approach to translating it themselves.
Right.
Translating a dead language like Coptic is formidable, but the author deliberately chose to avoid relying on other domestic Korean commentaries. They wanted to wrestle directly with the primary source.
So what tools did they actually use?
They used modern, highly academic tools. Things like the Kelia Online Coptic Dictionary out of the University of Göttingen, interactive translations by Martin Linson, and interlinear guides by Michael W. Grondin.
So they went completely DIY on a millennia-old text. That's bold.
Very bold.
But the commentary mentions a very specific translation philosophy that the author adopted. They chose to translate the text literally, like word for word, even when it sounded incredibly clunky or awkward.
Yes, they actively avoided smoothing it out into a pleasant, easy-to-read paraphrase.
See, I have to push back on that approach a little bit. If the author believes this text is a vital survival guide for the modern era, doesn't insisting on a clunky, literal translation risk alienating the everyday reader?
Just fair question.
Like, why make the reader stumble over weird ancient syntax instead of just making it accessible?
It is a valid concern, absolutely, but the author's defense of this method is deeply philosophical.
Okay, how so?
Well, if a translator smooths out an ancient text to make it easy to digest, that translator is inherently imposing their own modern interpretation onto the words.
Oh, I see. They're making choices for you.
Exactly. They might accidentally erase the mysteries, the strange ambiguities, and the nuanced mood of the original author. The source argues that the reader actually needs to feel the rough edges of the language.
So the friction is the point.
Yes. You are supposed to do the heavy lifting of decoding it because that friction is part of the spiritual exercise itself.
So the struggle is a feature, not a bug. And from what I understand from the source, Coptic itself has plenty of friction built right into it.
Oh, Coptic is a fascinating linguistic bridge. It essentially uses the 24 letters of the standard Greek alphabet, but because it needed to capture sounds that only existed in spoken Egyptian, it tacks on 6 additional letters from ancient Egyptian demonic script.
So because of that heavy Greek influence, the early Egyptian scribes sometimes didn't even bother translating Greek concepts into Coptic words. The source gives a brilliant example of this with the Greek word cosmos, which, means the world or the universe.
Yes, instead of finding a Coptic equivalent for cosmos, the scribes just sounded the word out using Coptic letters. They transliterated it.
Just literally spelling out Kosmos in the Coptic alphabet.
Exactly.
That detail is just so illuminating to me because it implies that these early spiritual seekers were having these massive aha moments, these huge existential awakenings. And their local language literally did not have the vocabulary to capture the scale of what they were feeling.
Oh, yeah.
They had to borrow foreign words just to express their own internal realization.
And that is the exact underlying mechanism of a spiritual awakening, right? You're reaching beyond the boundaries of your given culture.
Right.
And that boundary pushing is what brings us to the core friction of this entire deep dive. Because the real controversy of the Gospel of Thomas isn't just in the translation. It is in the structure of the text itself.
The canon clash. Because if you open up the Gospel of Thomas, it looks absolutely nothing like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John from the Standard Bible.
Not at all.
There is no overarching narrative. Jesus doesn't walk on water. There's no crucifixion. There are no miracles. It is just a raw list of 114 isolated quotes, sayings. Scholars call them logia.
And because it totally lacks that narrative structure, and because it wasn't included in the official institutional Bible, the author argues that mainstream religion often actively suppresses it.
Yeah.
The commentary takes a very firm stance against this suppression, specifically critiquing a theological doctrine known as organic inspiration.
Okay, let's unpack that term, because organic inspiration sounds like a really positive thing on the surface. How does the author argue that it's actually a tool for suppression?
So, organic inspiration is the doctrine that every single word of the canonical Bible was flawlessly and divinely authored, making the book entirely sufficient and completely finalized.
Okay.
The author of our commentary argues that institutions use this doctrine as a defense mechanism to create a closed loop.
A closed loop, meaning if it's not already in the book, we don't even have to talk about it.
Exactly. If an institution declares their specific text is a perfect closed loop, they never have to debate the actual contents of a new historical discovery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If a 1700-year-old jar is pulled out of the dirt containing the Gospel of Thomas, the institution doesn't have to engage with the theology at all. They simply say, it is outside our closed loop, therefore it is invalid.
So it's just a way to shut down the conversation.
The author definitely sees this as a mechanism for institutional control, rather than an actual framework for spiritual growth.
But to be clear here, because this is a massive distinction in the source, the author isn't saying the canonical Bible is flawed or bad.
Not at all.
The commentary actually argues that the traditional Bible and the Gospel of Thomas are complementary. They do not conflict.
Right, and the author asks us to look at the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation in the Standard Bible. They have entirely different writing styles, totally different theological frameworks, and completely different purposes.
Yeah, one's about the beginning of the world, the other is an apocalyptic vision of the end.
Exactly. Yet, they sit comfortably within the exact same binding, because readers understand they are different facets of a larger whole. The author's thesis challenges us to view the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical Gospels in the exact same way.
Let me try an analogy here. Tell me if this tracks. It sounds like the canonical Bible is the full, high-budget feature film. It has the sweeping plot, the character arcs, the timeline.
Okay, I like this.
But the Gospel of Thomas, on the other hand, is like an isolated audio track of just the most intense philosophical dialogue from the main character. You absolutely need the movie's plot, the narrative Bible, to give context to who is speaking and why.
Right.
But listening to that raw audio track on its own forces you to focus entirely on the meaning of the words without getting distracted by the scenery or the special effects.
That aligns beautifully with the author's perspective. In fact, the source material explicitly refers to the canonical Bible as a treasure house of narratives.
A treasure house.
Yeah. Because Thomas has no stories, it relies on that treasure house. A quote doesn't exist in a vacuum. The author argues that the Bible's rich stories illuminate the dense sayings in Thomas, and conversely, the sharp, unfiltered sayings in Thomas give us the key to unlocking deeper meanings within the Bible stories.
I want to actually look at one of these sayings to see this in action. The commentary highlights Logan 3, which I think is one of the most famous quotes in the text.
It is.
Jesus says, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you."
That specific saying captures the entire essence of the text. It actively dismantles the idea that salvation is a geographical location you go to after you die.
Right, or like a physical temple you have to visit.
Exactly. It redirects the seeker's attention entirely inward.
Which connects directly to the core philosophy the author brings up, the Delphic maxim, know thyself, or nothesauten in Greek, made famous by Socrates, inscribed on the Temple of Apollo. The author points out that this exact philosophy is the heartbeat of the Gospel of Thomas. Knowing your true self is equated with discovering the kingdom.
And this brings us to the most provocative modern application of the commentary. The author takes the 1700-year-old focus on the internal self and applies it directly to our current society, declaring that we are entering, or maybe have already entered, a post-religion era.
That is a really heavy, sweeping statement. Does the author think all religious institutions were just a mistake?
Not at all, and the nuance here is really critical. The commentary acknowledges that traditional churches, temples, and religious structures were absolutely vital for human history.
Yeah.
They provided community, ethical frameworks, and just basic moral survival. Without them, the author admits, people would have basically starved spiritually, but the thesis argues that their expiration date has arrived.
The expiration date on institutional religion. So what happens when that milk goes bad? Like, what are we supposed to do?
The author turns to another specific saying in the text to answer that. Logan 42 is incredibly brief. It translates simply to become passersby.
Become passersby, just 2 words, but the implication there is massive.
It is. It means you cannot take up permanent residence in the temple. While some people may still need these institutions temporarily, the true spiritual pilgrim must eventually walk past the institution.
Wow.
You have to learn from it and then keep walking. The ultimate goal is to stand alone, outside the safety of the crowd, as your true, authentic self. What the author terms the I ego, the existential self.
Man, I can totally see why an archbishop in 367 AD would want this buried in a jar.
Right.
If the ultimate goal is to walk past the church and become a passerby, you don't need the institution to intermediate for you anymore.
But I do have to ask, is the author just entirely anti-religion now? Like, are they saying we should burn down the traditional scriptures? It is vital to clarify that they are not saying that. The text explicitly states that the author deeply loves the Bible. They have spent countless hours, years of their life, sitting intimately with the Hebrew and Greek texts.
Okay, good to know.
The argument presented here is not against the ancient scriptures themselves. The argument is against the modern instinct to rely on religious leaders to hand you their answers.
So it is fundamentally a critique of outsourcing your spirituality.
Exactly. The author's point is that a priest, a pastor, or a guru might have an answer that is entirely beautifully correct for them.
Right.
But it cannot be the answer for you. Their words can serve as hints or signposts, but they are not your final truth. You can no longer ask someone else for the directions to your own internal life.
And that leads to this incredibly powerful concept the author introduces, the diaspora of the modern age. We usually use the word diaspora to describe a group of people who are physically scattered from their geographic homeland, right?
Yes.
But the commentary applies this spiritually.
The modern spiritual diaspora, these are the individuals who are consciously making the terrifying decision to leave the warmth and safety of the institutional crowd.
Yeah.
They are stepping out to mentally walk upright on their own. The author essentially views this commentary on the Gospel of Thomas as a guidebook for this exact diaspora.
It demands radical self-reliance.
Yeah.
It demands that you take on the frightening responsibility of questioning your own life, finding your own answers, and bearing the weight of your own existence without a safety net.
And that connects so deeply to the broader picture of why this text matters today. It proves that human nature and the core anxieties of our existence haven't really changed in 2 millennia.
Not at all.
We might have faster communication, but we are wrestling with the exact same internal void.
Tying this all together for you listening, it is just wild to zoom out and look at the timeline. A manuscript, written in a hybrid Frankenstein language, shoved into an earthen jar to escape the censorship of a powerful archbishop 1700 years ago.
Yeah.
It sits in the dark while the Roman Empire falls, while the Renaissance happens, while the Industrial Revolution completely changes the planet. It finally gets dug up by a farmer, digging for fertilizer, right as the modern world is restructuring itself after a global war.
It's cinematic.
And now it is speaking directly to the digital exhaustion we feel today.
Because today, the instinct to crowdsource our identity is stronger than ever. The Gospel of Thomas is basically a voice from the dirt telling you to stop looking outward for validation.
Right now, you can pull out your phone, open an artificial intelligence app, and ask an algorithm to write you a life plan, to solve your moral dilemmas, or to tell you what to care about. But AI cannot live your life for you.
No, it can't.
A religious leader cannot live your life for you. The text is demanding that you know yourself.
Which leaves us with a really critical lens to view our own lives through. If a text buried in the sand 17 centuries ago was desperately warning us against letting external institutional authorities dictate our inner truth, we have to ask ourselves what those authorities actually look like in our current era.
Because Archbishop Athanasius isn't sending letters to condemn your reading list anymore. The mechanisms of control have evolved.
They have. The authorities have definitely changed shape. So the question we want to leave you to ponder long after this discussion ends is this. What modern authorities, whether it's the algorithms curating your social media feed, the influencers you parasocially follow, or the overwhelming corporate culture you work in, what authorities are you currently allowing to write your life's narrative instead of doing the hard work of looking inward?
Are you living your own existential truth, or are you just echoing the script an institution handed to you? It is a heavy, necessary question worth sitting with. Thank you for joining us as we unpack the jar, the history, and the radical challenge of the Gospel of Thomas. We will catch you on the next deep dive.
Ancient scrolls reveal the past. Stories found were meant to last. Coptic words and sacred light complement, not oppose the right. Text unfold with careful hands. Truth emerges from the sands. Jesus' words and wisdom shine, guiding hearts to the divine. Through the words we see the way, breaking chains to find the day. Pilgrims walk the inner road, free from dogma, bear the load. Ancient wisdom lights the flame, restoring souls in freedom's Critics trace the hidden lines, meanings deep like ancient wines, bridging gaps with sacred lore, past to truths we're searching for. Through the words we see